Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, IU Insider, Indianapolis Star. It is Friday, July 12th, 2024. We haven't done one of these in a while, and I apologize. That's largely due to me being out of town here, there, and everywhere. But he is Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. Mike, how's it going? How's the summer?
Good. How are you doing, sir?
I'm good. A different kind of seltzer here.
Oh, new sponsor.
I'm sponsored by whatever's on sale at Kroger, and this week it was Polar. So the
Good ad
the
read. That's a good ad read.
the satisfying strawberry watermelon Polar Premium Seltzer.
It's a good ad
Uh,
read.
you what?
I said that's a good ad read.
Yeah, that's what I got. This is an Upland hat. Upland can absolutely sponsor us if they want to. We
You
will
just
drink
got
up.
stuff around. You just pulled all the stuff you have around your desk.
We will drink Upland if they on the podcast if they want.
Absolutely.
I mean, honestly, they don't even need to sponsor us. We'll just do that. We've done it before. We'll do it again. Um, it is. I don't call it the dog days of the off season, but certainly kind of the last little sort of rest here before things really start to gear up. Of course, Big Ten football media days is in about 2 weeks. Typically the quietest time around an athletics department is kind of like last week because they shut down the fiscal year at the end of June and then everybody goes on vacation around the 4th. So everybody's really kind of starting in earnest now to prepare for the upcoming athletic year. But obviously, it's more the end of July, beginning of August when stuff starts to pick up steam. But there were a couple things that got thrown up this week that I think were worth talking about. The big one, probably for a lot of people, is the non-conference schedule. Indiana announces its non-conference schedule. Because I absolutely came completely prepared. I'm just vamping while I pull up the non-conference schedule.
What
Indiana
do you
will
need to
open
know?
with
What do you need to know? I got it.
Indiana will open with SIU Edwardsville November 6th, Eastern Illinois November 10th, South Carolina. We knew that game was on November 16th. UNC Greensboro the 21st, 3 games in 3 days in Atlantis the 27th through the 29th. December 3rd, Sam Houston State. December 6th, Miami of Ohio. There's a 15-day gap where I think we can all probably assume that's where the two Big Ten games will land, the two December Big Ten games between Miami of Ohio on the 6th and UT Chattanooga on the 21st. Then a week off for Christmas and Winthrop on the 28th before Indiana prepares for the restart of Big Ten play in January 2025. I know I've written on this. I think we've all talked about it in some way. I mean, your first blush thoughts, I suppose.
Gross. It's just gross. I
Yeah, I
mean,
mean,
look, they don't leave the no neutral site. Uh,
they
you
do have
know,
neutral site. Atlantis is
what?
a neutral site.
Well, no, I mean, no, outside of Atlantis, outside the tournament, no neutral site game in Indianapolis, nothing there, no really big name opponents. I mean, South Carolina is the only team that made the tournament last year outside the battle for Atlantis. I mean, they're really pinning their hopes on winning a game or two against somebody big time there.
Yeah, I mean, it is. I kind of like alternately. I sort of think like a. I understand anyone who looks at the schedule and isn't that impressed with it. B, it is actually just kind of the formula Mike Woodson's used for the last 3 years now. And C, I'm actually a little bit surprised, given that they chose not to challenge themselves with a road game or as you said, a neutral site game away from the Bahamas, that they didn't schedule a little easier at home. And I know those all kind of, I know those three sort of takeaways don't entirely square with one another, but you know, number one, I guess just talking about the formula, like this is what Mike Woodson did the last 2 years as well, which is 4 name games. And we can have a conversation. Who do they play? We don't know who they'll play in Atlantis yet. In that first game, they're pretty much going to have to beat one of Gonzaga or Arizona. And unless somebody's a lot better than we expected, they're going to have to beat one of Gonzaga or Arizona, for Atlantis to really deliver a high quality win for just for like the sake of reference. Bart Torvik's preseason projections have Gonzaga 9th, Arizona 10th, Indiana 31st, Louisville 62nd, Oklahoma 67th, Providence 60th, West Virginia 83rd, and Davidson 157th. So there's going to be a lot of opportunities for maybe what you would call like quantity good wins there. Games that probably will reliably stay quad 1 or quad 2 wins away from home. But to really get a marquee game win there, you're probably going to have to beat Gonzaga or Arizona. It's obviously, even if South Carolina follows up on last season's success with another good season, difficult to see that game as a really sort of like superlative opportunity. But the point is more that Mike Woodson has always just kind of looked at that number and just said four is what is kind of the right number for him. And the difference is, in the past, Indiana's had some of those games decided for them. So like they went to New York last year, and New York's, the Empire Classic scheduled those games out 2 years ago. They sought out Arizona and Kansas, but they had Xavier on the road and UNC at home determined by TV contracts. So this is the first year where it's kind of all up to Indiana. And for whatever reason, because Indiana's not actually, from my understanding, paying South Carolina anything for that game, and it's only a one-off. They're not going back the other way at any point. For whatever reason, Indiana didn't, wanted to add a game that had some meaning at home in the non-conference, but did not want to have it tie them to anything beyond this season, basically. So, yeah, you're putting a lot of eggs in the Atlantis basket, but there is kind of an extent to which this is not that far removed from what Mike Woodson has kind of done with his schedules the 2 years prior to this one.
Yeah, I guess the difference from a fan perspective is that, just such of a big chunk of it is at that one tournament, obviously. And so the schedule just looks bare, almost, especially when you don't know those three opponents. And like you said, without knowing the kind of the schedule of the games, how they perform, what can you get out of that? Like if that doesn't go very well, are they in a situation where they were last year, where they just don't have quality wins, and so you really you leave everything to the Big Ten schedule. And I mean, obviously they didn't, this is the kind of schedule you kind of see, if the Big Ten expanded a little bit, where you just don't schedule much, but still same amount of games to the Big Ten, still kind of the same format from last year, just obviously expanded conference. But I don't know, just I underwhelmed, and I think I can understand from a fan perspective, just underwhelmed in terms of what's out, what they have on there.
I mean, what it comes down to me is you had better make the most of the Bahamas. And I mean, that's not like a galloping insight. It's just like you need to go out there and at very least either A, beat Gonzaga or Arizona, or B, play your way to the championship game. And you probably have to do one to do the other. Although
Do they put out? I've not covered the Battle for Atlantis. Is
I
that
think I think it's just 2 4-team
pods?
Yeah, basically, and it's the same thing. It's the same thing as Maui, I believe, where it's like you either stay in the winners bracket or you drop into the losers bracket. And if you win your first game and lose your second game, then you'll play in the losers winners bracket, or however you want to term that. But the point is, it's Creighton was supposed to be in that, and they backed out because they went to that NIL tournament out in Vegas. I think it might have been Providence that replaced them, and Creighton. I mean, I'd have to look at it here, but I think that I'm fairly sure that Creighton. I mean, Providence is 60th in the preseason in Torvik's preseason rankings. And these are all projections, but Creighton's 13th. So there was a time when you kind of had a much more solid kind of top four. Indiana's 31st, in terms of like, hey, if you beat any of these four teams, you're going to come away with probably a quad one neutral site win, no matter what else happens in the tournament. Now you are kind of in a situation where if you're on the same side of the bracket with Gonzaga or Arizona, then you need to get to that game and win it. If you're not, then you probably need to get to the championship game, and you might even, to some extent, need to hope that one of them gets there. Although, of course, if somebody else gets there, that could very well be because Oklahoma or Louisville or whoever is better than we expected, and that winds up being a quality opportunity. South Carolina's won. I mean, they won 26 games last season. They won, I think, 13 games in the SEC. They made it to the tournament. On the other hand, the computers didn't love them last year. They finished last year in the 50s in KenPom, and they're 54th in Bart's preseason projections. So I mean, from a computer perspective, that's probably at best going to be a quad two, unless South Carolina really outperforms their projections, which is possible. What surprised me, and I mean, Did you catch up on? Did you like at any point like fence the the discourse around the Big 12 last season and what the Big 12 did with its net rankings?
Just piled up
Like,
lopsided win.
yeah, like just went to the bottom of the barrel for like the guaranteed home games and
Yeah.
said we're going to win all these games by 40. We're going to jack up our efficiency margins. We're going to inflate them at the point in the season when it's the easiest to change them because the numbers aren't baked in yet. And then by the time we get to conference play, we'll all have such good net rankings that like every win will be a quality win and very few losses will actually be that damaging because everybody's generally well regarded by the net. Um, I mean, I'm not saying like everybody should just race to the bottom, like, in general. Um, but I do think that I was surprised, like, if you look at this schedule and if you want to include South Carolina in this, South Carolina, Greensboro, Sam Houston State, Chattanooga, and Winthrop are all somewhere between 50 and 175 in Bart Torvik's preseason rankings last year. And that's not an aberration. Last season, Indiana definitely played some worse teams in non-conference, but I mean, like Florida Gulf Coast at the beginning of the season was ranked in the KenPom top 150. Both Wright State and Morehead State ended the season 158th and 116th, respectively. You also had teams like, I think Harvard at one point last season was, in fact, when Indiana played them, Harvard was in the 130s in KenPom. Kennesaw State had just come off that NCAA tournament run, so they were the kind of team that could, in theory, have played themselves in that direction. My point is, listen, if Indiana wins these games, then it does even more for, at least in theory, their numbers. But the downside is you're scheduling some teams here that may come to Assembly Hall feeling like they have like they're justified in thinking they could win, playing like it. And then if you get in trouble, then you have what happens last season where, for example, yes, Indiana beat Morehead State, but Morehead State was up 15 in that game with 9 minutes left. So, like, that was not a good win for Indiana in the end. And when we got to the end of the season and we were talking about the fact that despite the fact they had 19 wins and went 500 in the Big Ten, Indiana was nowhere near the NCAA tournament conversation. One of the primary reasons for that was the computers just did not like their profile because of that underwhelming non-conference. I'm just a little. I mean, listen. Again, you want to go back 2 years. Indiana brought in. I'm trying to think. Kennesaw State that season. They brought in Morehead State that season, and again, Morehead State wound up not being maybe quite as good as people expected, but they still won 22 games. Indiana didn't necessarily just kind of like race to the bottom with its non-conference. Mike Woodson seems to like that blend of like four sort of marquee games, 3 to 4 games, teams somewhere in like the KenPom 100 to 200-ish range, and then fill out the back end with games you should be winning comfortably, sub 250, that kind of thing. I guess I'm just a little surprised they didn't make life a little easier for if you're going to take this approach anyway, and you're just going to say, South Carolina and Atlantis and everything else is gravy. I'm just a little surprised they didn't, make that yellow brick road a little bit smoother for themselves in the other games, if you know what I mean.
So just even worse opponents.
Yeah, I mean, basically, I mean, like, UNC Greensboro, I think, has won something like 20 games in like 7 of the last 10 seasons. Winthrop is comfortably the best team in its conference, or the best program, at least. I don't know about team, but certainly program in its conference. Sam Houston State is ranked. I can find it while we're talking here. Sam Houston State's ranked 114th in KenPom or in Torvik's preseason rankings. That's a team that won 21 games a season ago. 26 games the year before that. Like uh, these are teams that could have every reason to believe they can come to Assembly Hall and give Indiana some trouble. And maybe Mike Woodson wants that challenge, but we've talked about how in college, it's not just that you win. It does matter how you win. And I'm just a little surprised Indiana maybe didn't make some elements of its life easier for itself in November, December, given that it was already, I don't want to say taking the path of least resistance, but certainly not piling too much onto its plate, beyond Atlantis.
Yeah, I mean that's worked for the Big 12, but I mean if like everybody does that at some point, isn't there diminishing returns on that strategy?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think what winds up happening is, the teams in the middle start having to play each other a little bit more, basically.
Yeah.
But and the other part of it too is, I guess, to be fair to Indiana, for it to work the way it worked for the Big 12, you need it to be a conference wide strategy. You need everyone to be doing that, so that, because the whole point with the Big 12 wasn't just to win a bunch of games, it was to win them that way, so that when they got to conference play, no matter who you played, they were
They had
their
the
net,
same they had the same benefit of the offseason
yeah,
schedules. And
their
yeah.
their net ranking was such that a win was a boost and a loss wasn't that bad for either side. So, I mean, I don't know. I just like there was kind of that immediate reaction that you had, which was just like, this isn't a very good non-conference schedule. And then I looked at it and I basically said, I don't think it is, certainly at the top end outside of Atlantis. But I'm surprised that Indiana's kind of put. I'm surprised that Indiana's pushing itself as consistently as it seems to be with some of the games it should win, rather than maybe adding one more tough game and maybe seeking out like an Auburn and Atlanta type situation, and then leaving the rest of it over to one side. I don't know. And then there's some other considerations too. The Big Ten games are going to fall slightly later in the calendar, like only like half a week to a week later, but slightly later in the calendar. Maybe for whatever, maybe there's some vagary of the conference schedule this year that it prevented them from seeking out a game in um, one of those marquee December weekends. You mentioned the Indy thing. I did some checking. The conference is not like finalized on where it's going to be for its conference tournaments next year. I guess I just wouldn't be surprised if it's Indianapolis. And you also obviously wouldn't be surprised if, like, Mike Woodson could get a little more guidance on that than what the Big Ten would be willing to sort of like announce or publicly sort of reveal before all the sort of ink is dried on whatever needs done. Because when the Big Ten went to Minneapolis, it interrupted the Indianapolis Chicago rotation. Chicago was the last host in that sort of two city rotation. So in theory, it would be Indianapolis's turn if they just return to that sort of back and forth. So maybe the program got some kind of high sign that it'll be in Indy, so we won't worry about a game in Indy. We'll fill up our season ticket packages, and then our fans will see us in Indianapolis in March. I don't know.
Was it so? It was a two. It was before it was Indy and Chicago. Then they added Minneapolis, and that took away Indy states.
Well, yeah, I mean, basically, it's like they pause. I mean, that Indy Chicago rotation has been pretty consistent. It was in Indianapolis for like, I want to say like 2007 to 2012, something like that. Like they just stuck it there for a while. Then
Yeah,
they went back to the rotation starting in 2013, and then they held that rotation until they moved it to Washington D.C. in 2017, and then New York in 2018, and then from 2019 through to 2023, it went back and forth, save for the one year that they hosted it in Indianapolis for COVID reasons. They moved. It was supposed to be in Chicago, and Chicago had like ordinances against having too many a certain number of people in a conference room together at the same time,
yeah,
because
yeah.
and it basically led to the fact that teams weren't going to be able to have meetings legally, like watch film or anything. So, but I guess everyone's presumption has been that, you know, what I was told when it was in Minneapolis last year was the conference did not think they would be back there the next year, not because they didn't like it, but just because, I think Minneapolis had seen that as a one-off even at the time, that like that Minneapolis had kind of started making plans for other things in that window, because you have to book concerts, events months, if not years out in advance for those things, and you have to bid for the rights to host them, and you have to put together whole packages and things. But it's fair to say I don't think the conference expected to be back in Minneapolis this year, after last year. Maybe that's just because the people I talked to were so confused by the utter darkness in the media work area that they just couldn't keep their head straight. But um, you would also think, I think anyway, that if you're going to do like LA or Vegas,
Vegas, yeah,
you would be further out ahead of that by now.
yeah.
So I
Hold on.
just it just makes sense to me that they would maybe return to the Indy Chicago rotation for like 4 years, and then you do LA, one year, or Vegas, or whatever. I don't know.
Gotcha.
Yeah, there we go. That's it.
That was
Scheduling
an
is
education. That was an education.
scheduling is done forever. Um, anything else on the schedule? Any other bits?
Not really. Does it fit with his ethos that he'll play anybody? I mean, that's what he kind of tried to talk about. That's what the schedule doesn't feel like. It sort of fits that. I ain't afraid of competition, and I'll play anybody. And then
I
there's
think they
no
just see Bahamas as
as like the end all be all.
yeah, as what they're going to walk out and do this year. I mean, it's and it's. I mean, it. Listen, the flip side to kind of all this, and I think we're both being pretty skeptical of this schedule in different ways, but the flip side to all this is if Indiana, let's say, opens with Louisville, then plays Providence, then plays Arizona, and either wins the battle for Atlantis or even loses, but loses respectably or something, then they probably weren't completely. I mean, if Indiana wins the battle for Atlantis, they're justified in this. Then it worked. Fair enough. Obviously, non-conference has been a little bit more difficult to navigate for Mike Woodson at times in the last couple of years. But if Indiana goes to that level of presumably beating at least one of Gonzaga or Arizona and winning, arguably the premier sort of non-conference tournament, then they'll be justified, especially if they also hold serve at home. And at that point, they'd be 11-1 or 11-0 in the non-conference, and they'd be sailing. But I think that agree with it or disagree with it. I think they just are saying we think this should be what makes the difference essentially for us. So, and the South Carolina game is also fascinating to me. Like I said, I don't believe they're paying South Carolina anything, and it's only a one-off. It's rare that you would get another Power 5 school willing to come to your place without any sort of payment or any sort of reciprocity at all. And it's also interesting to me because it seemed intentional to add a game that at least had some pop for your season ticket holders. Hey, they were in the tournament last year, could be again this year, promising young coach, etc. But it seemed like they really wanted to keep their options open beyond like there was they didn't want to set up something they would be tied into beyond this season. That was interesting to me as well. And I don't know.
Don't they have Kentucky in 2025 at Kentucky?
The Kentucky series restarts in 25. They're expected to be in Maui again in 26. So those are the big pieces of the schedule that we know.
Is Kentucky 25, 27 then?
Let me look at it. IU Kentucky series. Let's see. Indiana Kentucky series set to return. I don't think so. No, it's just the 20th, December 20th, 25, December 27th, 26, December 18th, 27, December 16th, 28.
Oh, so it does run 4 years, but at the end, the 27th is the neutral site.
The 27th is the 2 days after Christmas. That is the game at Lucas Oil. It's technically an IU home game from a financial perspective of who's going to have to staff it and who probably gets the most ticket take from it. But I mean, I it just seemed like they wanted to leave their options more open, that there wasn't. And I talked to Scott Dolson a couple times about potential interest in adding Kansas, and it seemed like Kansas had, some of these Kentucky weekends were, if you sort of put it all together, weekends where Kansas was like the weekends where that Kansas game fell previously. And then Kansas has its series with Missouri the weekend before, which obviously is a rivalry game. So it didn't feel like it was really going to work long term for Indiana and Kansas to extend because there just wasn't kind of a natural date to put that game on. So I don't know that there's necessarily a hard and fast. We did South Carolina, and we only did it for this year because we absolutely are locked into doing this, and this in the future.
Well, it could also have been we don't know. South Carolina hasn't announced their schedule. I mean, they could have been. What their looks like. It could have been them just pushing for something too to try to.
Yeah, that could be. the advantage for them is just getting the opportunity to it's kind of a no lose for them, right? Like
Right.
if they come to Bloomington and they lose, then hey, you went to Indiana. Not a lot of people win there. Good for you. But if you um you know if you go up there and you win that game, it turns into a much bigger thing. So yeah, there you go. Schedule, ladies and gentlemen, college basketball schedule. Uh, any thoughts on the Adidas deal?
Whenever just deals come up, no, whenever deals come up, because I covered Auburn, I just the Under Armour deal that they made with the stock always makes me chuckle.
What was that again? Remind me.
They took like a ton of stock in Under Armour as like part of the deal and like touted it, and it was like, going to be like this huge financial windfall, and then it became not as much of a financial, and by not as much I mean like not at all.
Yeah.
Uh, now they're with
Now,
Nike.
isn't Auburn Nike now or
Yeah, next year. Yeah.
yeah.
It starts next year. Not this. This is the last year, I think, the Under Armour deal. But no, those deals, I mean, it's all clothing now, right? I mean, used to be, I think somebody talked to, oh, they want these bigger money, and it's not what it was. I mean, for a few schools it is, but I mean, it's mostly just apparel.
For the high end football schools, it's still moving at a pretty substantial level, like your Ohio States, your Alabamas. Um, it's important, like, to always remember when somebody says so and so's deal is worth such and such million per year.
Oh,
Uh,
it's clothes. Yeah.
yeah, that that is very nearly never just cash, because not least because all you do is literally turn around and hand some of that cash back because you need your apparel provider. You need to pay them to make your uniforms, your helmets, your cleats, your shoes, whatever. But I mean, I think certainly for most schools, even like let's say your average Big Ten school like Indiana, I think the days of those deals as an arm race, like a financial arms race, are kind of over. And I think that, like Scott Dolson told me, he said, we were taking less because we're taking less cash, but our studies found that if we took a similar product to where we'd been, as we kind of want to expand what we give our athletes, we would just be handing that cash back to order more. And I'm not saying this is, the most master stroke of all negotiating deals or whatever. I just think that for a lot of schools, this is kind of more what it's going to look like, especially post COVID and certainly post NIL. Those are two things I think. COVID, I think, obviously just affected everyone's finances and changed the way everyone thinks about, finances and things. And then obviously from an NIL perspective, the departments essentially were acting as intermediaries on these things. And so that the apparel companies could have access to the athletes and to that stage, right? Like to that, high level college athletics. But now you don't need to do that. I mean, at least, as I'm aware of, at least 3 IU athletes have signed NIL deals with Adidas since the rules changed 3 years ago.
All basketball, right?
2 basketball and 1 softball. Bree Copeland signed an NIL deal with Adidas in 2022 as well. So I think it was 22. And I think there is kind of some handshake agreement to continue in that space, like, for Indiana to remain kind of a prominent sort of, feeding, I don't know what you call it, like feeder area or whatever, like for Adidas to continue working with IU athletes in that space, essentially. That doesn't mean that Adidas is contractually obliged to put like $1 million in NIL money into IU every year. It just means like, sort of again, like a handshake agreement. But yeah, I think that the nature of those deals for most schools just are changing now. And listen, I mean, the other part of this is the schools can also afford it now, because the schools, there was a time when that was a bigger chunk of your budget, however you wanted to slice it, whether it was the raw cash you were getting or the money you weren't having to spend because they were providing it in free product or whatever. There was a time where that was a much larger chunk of your budget than it is now. Indiana reported $144.7 million in athletics revenues last year. That is a record if you account for the fact that the year before, when I think they were at about 166, like 38 of that came from a gift from the IU Foundation. So a one-time gift to backfill COVID losses. So like in terms of normal year-on-year revenues, like Indiana's richer than it's ever been. Um, the fact that the idea that you're cutting about $1.5 million in monetary compensation out of the Adidas deal, I don't know that it's, I mean, it's not a windfall for Indiana by any means, but I don't know that it's necessarily something anybody needs to stress over either, basically.
You've been here longer, obviously, you have some more perspective on this. Are fans happy with Adidas in terms of, like, would they have rather I'm trying to get, like, be on Nike's radar at all, or like is it just sort of I don't
I
know, they're
mean,
just
there has always been, especially Nike's sort of like basketball space. There has always been sort of this like, why can't we be a Nike school? Indiana was a Nike school for I think 3 or 4 years in the early 2000s. It was not a good experience, was my understanding. I wasn't on the beat at that time. My understanding was the department did not have a good experience. That they just felt like outside of football and to an extent men's basketball, there was just no real interest in like you know productive partnership, basically. Um, I mean, Indiana has a long stem. I mean, Indiana obviously had some time with Adidas in the Bob Knight days because Knight always wore those red sweaters. They either said like starter or Adidas on them, depending on who Indiana was paired with. IU soccer has deep ties with Adidas. At least there have been. I don't know if there still are, but there have been like multiple alumni at one time in senior administrative positions at Adidas. So like that relationship has kind of kept it stronger. I mean, you know, Indiana's been with Adidas now continuously for 20 years.
right.
And when you look at, Nike's biggest basketball brands, it already has a ton of them. It has Kentucky, it has Duke, it has UConn, it has UNC. Adidas is probably going to be more likely to prioritize you when it's got Louisville and Kansas and Indiana and maybe UCLA. I can't remember where UCLA went when they got out of their Under Armour deal. But the point is, you're likely to be more of a priority, I would say, based on both the relationships and also um, the sort of the prestige of the program and where you fit in Adidas's overall college athletics portfolio if you stay with Adidas. At least that's been my perception for a while. I do think fans' complaints around licensing and merchandise are fair, that it's hard to get a hold of some of the stuff that Adidas makes, and Adidas will make stuff like coaches will wear polos or pullovers and people will want to go find that stuff and it's hard to find, and Adidas doesn't produce it enough and doesn't offer it enough. And I think that's also, in a roundabout way, one reason why IU engaged that third party company Legends for its like some of its licensing and like apparel sales, and that framework was to try and smooth some of that out as well. And I know Scott Dolson said that Indiana expects an uptick in revenues from that decision and that relationship. I think they're basically kind of like almost like a third party facilitator to just make the process of selling this stuff to fans a little bit smoother. But I think fans have had legitimate complaints about like what Adidas hasn't been making available consistently enough. But in the aggregate, my perception was and kind of remains that it's better to be kind of a higher priority at Adidas than a lower priority at Nike, essentially.
That makes sense. UCLA signed with Nike.
Okay. And again, like I get, I mean, Nike has such exposure in the, in the
Shoe.
in the shoe space that, I think Anthony Edwards might be Adidas, but I know that Nike, Jordans and LeBron and all that, I know Nike is at a different level. But again, there was a time when these things were just like, you took the last three deals that got signed at schools that were at your sort of rough level and said, okay, we want 15% more than this. And it just kind of kept going up and up. And obviously at a certain point, the shoe companies are going to say, well, we don't have that money. So we're not, like, just like we're seeing with TV contracts at a certain point, there's a cap on that market and
Right.
you can't just keep increasing. And I think it's more about trying to find within the parameters of what you're offered, what your best opportunity is. And that's what Indiana's decided here, is that they just want to go kind of all in on being a product priority for Adidas, and we'll see how it goes. 10 years. So who knows where we'll all be.
Won't have to revisit soon. Yep.
Exactly. We'll leave it there for this week. He's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. I think we will be off again next week. Forgive me. I will be on one last mini vacation. But we'll come back, obviously, maybe preview football media days, kind of what we're looking at from Indiana, what we're looking at, maybe just Big Ten wide. I mean, I think as things stand today, like talking right now today, we're talking about an 18-team Big Ten. They're all here now. I would presume they're all in the door at this point. So he's Mike Niziolek. I'm
Bowl
Zach.
game, except for bowl games.
Yeah, well, it's going to be weird, right? When like two Big Ten teams meet in like the Las Vegas Bowl or whatever. Like that's going to happen.
Not this year, next year. Next year.
Next year. Okay. Oh, well, still going to be weird. Anyway, in fact, it'll probably be weirder next year when they've been in the league for 2 years.
That's true. That's probably true.
But he's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman for the Herald Times and the Indianapolis Star. Thank you so much for listening. This has been Mind Your Banners for July 12th, 2024. We will talk to you soon.